They're like,
I
coming
say,
at
well, I think there needs to be a sound studio, at your land. That'll be excellent.
ya.
Totally.
All right, everyone, welcome to Glitterary. This is session 2. We've already had a great, first session on publishing. I'm Jamie Harker. I am the director of the Sarah Eisman Center for Women and Gender Studies and an English professor at the University of Mississippi. But more importantly, for today's event, I am a new bookstore owner of Violet Valley Bookstore. And it's my pleasure today to get to talk with one of the great feminist bookstores in the country, 2 members from Kerris Bookstore. So today we have E.R. Anderson, who is executive director of Kerris Circle, and Sarah Luce Look, who is a co-owner of Kerris Books and More. E.R. and Sarah, welcome to Glitterary.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
I'm delighted to have you here and to talk and to learn. You've always been an inspiration to me, and I'm really pleased to be here. I always tell this story to you, and I apologize, but in 1993, when I was just about to start my PhD program, I was visiting my parents in Atlanta, and I wandered into Charis by accident with my Mormon mother. And I had to get rid of my mother quickly because I knew I couldn't browse with her there, but I had gone there and knew it was the place. So I've been going back there every time I get a chance and just love the bookstore so much. So I was thinking today, if you don't mind, we could start, if you could just tell us a little bit, how did you get involved in bookselling and with Kerris?
You want to start since you
Sure.
are my senior?
So I first went to Kerris in 1988 when we were at our 419 Moreland Avenue location, which was our first location. I was in my first year at Emory University. I had come, I'm from Massachusetts, so it was my first time in Atlanta, being that far away from home. And I didn't even realize it when I got to Emory that Emory would have a women's studies program, but that's really what I wanted to do. And it was just called women's studies at that time. And I went to Kerris in a van for the first time on a field trip with my women's studies class. And I loved it. And then I was Kerris's first intern, academic intern. And then I graduated from school, and Kerris didn't have a full-time job for me yet, but I knew I wanted to work in a bookstore. I had worked in libraries all through high school and through college during all my vacations and winter breaks and all that, and summertime. So when Kerris had a full-time job, I got to go work there after I had managed another bookstore because they really wanted someone who actually had bookstore experience at that time. And when I started at Kerris in 1994, we actually were moving into our new location, which was at that time across the street at 1189 Euclid Avenue, which I always told people I came with the building. And then we actually moved in 2019 to our current location at Agnes Scott College. But I started out as an intern, and then I became full-time, and then I became a co-owner in 2008, somewhere around there. And I'm the book buyer and general manager. And it's my life's work, and it's what I love to do.
And I came to Kerris in 1997 as a 15-year-old. I was a writer, and Kerris had started a young women writers program, and my mother thought I was getting into too much trouble after school and was like, "You like to write, why don't you go join this thing?" And I thought it sounded dorky, and I did not want to go do that. But I ended up going and finding it to be really exciting because it was a place where at the time, as a young butch lesbian, I could be queer and a writer and talk about all the stuff I wanted to talk about, which at the time was mostly just girls. And that was, I was allowed to be myself. And I learned, it also was the place where I got a political education. So, I got to hang out with older people who then handed me books that were really foundational to my sense of self. And I met other young people who then led me to other kind of programs and writing experiences in the city. So I joined a teen writing newspaper called Vox Youth Communication, and there I met other people who were doing political organizing, and I got into prison abolition work and doing peer-to-peer writing programs in youth detention centers. I went to college in New York, and during the summers and winters, we had like a very long winter break because they didn't, I think, want to pay for the heat. So we would get like a month and a half off for the winters. And so I basically hung around Charis so much that they gave me a job unpacking boxes. And I just kept coming back, and they let me, have basically a book selling job. And then I went to Ole Miss for my master's in English and was one of Jamie's students. And I knew, basically that I did not particularly want to be an academic, but I wanted to be in the world of books. And so I came back to Atlanta, and they created a writing programs coordinator job for me in the nonprofit, basically to just give me something to do so I could make a tiny bit of money while also being a bookseller. From that, I ended up becoming the overall program coordinator in 2009. And then eventually in 2013, I became the executive director, and I've been the executive director ever since.
Yes, so ER took my very first graduate class. I always feel like I should apologize that you stuck with me in that. I hope I've improved, though my students may have other thoughts on that. We'll see. But that was a real pleasure to get to meet you there and then to come and see you at Kerris. So you've gotten, collectively you have different kinds of experiences at the bookstore in different phases. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how it's evolved over time in the time that you've been there, and the ways you've sort of thought about adapting to and growing and dealing with changes.
Yeah, I think one of the things that currently we are one of 5 nominees for the Publishers Weekly Bookstore of the Year award. And one of the things that we have to do as part of that is put together sort of a nomination packet as to why we should really be the bookstore of the year. And it's encouraging us to think a lot about the phases of our history. And one of the sort of gifts of our 46 years of history is that we have made a lot of mistakes, and we've been in a lot of mess over the years and had a lot of hard times. And so this past year, when I think a lot of people have just been walking around numb and shocked at how hard the world is, we've taken it slightly more in stride because we're like, well, we're used to not making much money. Like, well, we're used to things being kind of scary. We're used to, folks who are living on the edge, and folks who are already marginalized, and, so much of the things that have made life hard for so many people are not shocking. And, a lot of people have talked about the police murders of not the police murders of Ahmaud Arbery, because he was murdered by vigilantes, but the murders of Breonna Taylor and of George Floyd. And, those were racial reckonings for a lot of people, but for people in our community at Kerris, they were not reckonings. Those murders were just 3 more awful deaths in a long series of awful deaths. And so our experience of the last year has been supporting our community members, some of whom were new to thinking about white supremacy and police violence, but many of whom were just like, yeah, it's another day in paradise. Like, screw you. I don't, I'm exhausted. So, a lot of our experience as being white booksellers who are in the practice of feminist anti-racism and always kind of trying to think about what it means to be a multiracial organization in the South is really holding that tension of wanting to bring white people into this work and wanting to unambiguously politicize people, right? Like, we are always trying to pull people further left and hold space for Black grief and joy and, whatever the space needs to be in that time. And whether that's in our programming or the books that we sell, that feels like a big through line for Kerris. And I think over the last 46 years, we have just gotten better at it. But we've gotten better at it because we've been messy and messed up. And I think so often the way that particularly white people who are of good faith and good intent engage around anti-racist practice is sort of this desire to walk a tightrope where they never fall off. And in my experience, the only way that organizationally or individually you actually become of any use to movement work is if you fall off a lot. Um, and so I think, Kerris has really gotten better because we have learned how to make mistakes and do repair work, and learn from those mistakes in loving ways. And people have given us a lot of grace, but they've also been really clear about the ways that we could show up and do better. And I think we've also taken those opportunities to heart again and again and again. So I would say the phases of Charis have been many, many phases, right? But the one that feels most present, I think, is often around this, like, what is the role of activism in our lives, and that feels so central at this time.
I think we often do a lot of the cultural work of supporting activists sort of behind the scenes also. And I mean, when we think of the long list of authors and activists that have come through our doors and read at Kerris or performed or given book talks, or have met. We've had a lot of groups that have met at Kerris also throughout the years. I was just thinking about that Southerners on New Ground had early meetings at Kerris. ZAMI, a Black lesbian organization, used to have early meetings at Kerris. The Atlanta Lesbian Health Initiative, when it was first forming, had early meetings at Kerris. I was thinking about that Sarah Schulman, back when publishers used to really send authors on book tours, she used her publisher book tour money when she was on a novel tour to basically go and create lesbian Avenger chapters around the country. She went to queer and feminist bookstores because there were, at that time, which was 1993, there were over 100 feminist bookstores and even more other queer bookstores at that time. And my friends and I were there. And so Atlanta got a Lesbian Avengers chapter, and then we got a Dyke March, and that happened because Sarah Schulman came to Kerris.
That's perfect. That leads to my next question. I forgot to mention to start those for the participants here. As you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and feel free to use the chat for things. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll work that in. So don't be shy. As you're thinking of things, feel free to jump it in there. So you mentioned all the meetings, and one of the things that queer and feminist bookstores have always done have been the kind of community hub, a resource space, an inclusive place, like almost a resource center. Could you talk a little bit about the different ways maybe that's changed or that you function now to not just sell books, but to create community?
So we, in part because we have this hybrid model, we're a for-profit and nonprofit hybrid organization, we have more opportunities to do that work explicitly. All of our programming is funded under our nonprofit. And I think that allows us to take risks that other bookstores maybe can't always do. It allows us to really, in part because we are so explicitly mission driven, we have the ability to say no to a lot of stuff that is not right for us. And one of the things that has been interesting in the last 5 years is, as more and more feminist and queer books become more mainstream within the big 5 presses, there's more and more to say no to. And I mean that lovingly, but there's more just very mainstream LGBTQ stuff. There's more very mainstream feminist stuff that is not quite our blend. And so it's meant that our programming has gotten more and more specific. Our mission is always to center diverse and marginalized voices. And so considering who counts as marginalized, that's always a shifting target. And I think that means for us in our community work, really looking at the intersections of poverty and access to resources in many, many ways. So one of the things that's been scary about the pandemic is when you have a physical space where folks can just walk in and ask for help, that's a low bar to entry, right? Whether it's often people are not always brave enough to ask for help right off the bat. Often they'll be hanging out kind of in the recognizing violence section of our store, which includes books about domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and also some systemic violence. And we'll kind of see like, okay, this person's been over there a long time and just kind of lingering. And what we do in our work is sort of draw those folks out and say, you know, is there something you're looking for? You need help? You know, is there something we can tell you about these books? And eventually, you know, the person will say like, well, you know, I found out that my child has been abused by my husband. I found out that, you know, something terrible has happened in my family, or something terrible happened to me last week and I don't know where else to go. And from that point, our job is to say, okay, like here's some books you could read, but also here are all the people in Atlanta or in Georgia who do this work, who you can trust. These are the lawyers you can go to. These are the doctors you can go to. These are the community organizations. You don't have a place to go tonight. Here's where you can go. And I think that's such a crucial role that feminist bookstores play. And, you know, in theory that LGBTQ community centers play, but Atlanta doesn't have an LGBTQ community center and hasn't for a long time. So, you know, we really are this clearinghouse for information. And so often people who sit at numerous, you know, crossroads of marginalized identities, it's like one part of their identity could be well served by a doctor or, you know, say like the Salvation Army, but then another part of their identity might be harmed by seeking out that resource. So part of it is also to be like, okay, you're a trans woman and you need a place to sleep because you're experiencing, you know, houselessness. Okay, where can you actually go that's going to be okay for you? Or you're a mother with a 17-year-old boy and a 3-month-old daughter. Where can you go? Because in Atlanta, a lot of the resources are not, you can't have a teenage son because they are still very gendered. So that hurts trans people, but that also hurts cisgender people who have children of different genders. So, you know, I think that's the part of our work that's really hard to explain. And people who are unfamiliar with the concept of feminist bookstores are like, I'm sorry, are you a social worker? Like, why are you doing this? That doesn't have anything to do with books. But that is, you know, so few people trust the resources that are available to them, and they don't necessarily know where to get good information.
I'm pausing to see if you want to weigh in, Sarah.
Not at the moment. You keep going.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I know what you're talking about. You know, that's as an you know, one of the few out professors when I started at the University of Mississippi, I would get a lot of people coming to my office, and I would feel really out of my depth, you know, of like trying to find resources, but, you know, thinking like you have to learn how to do that. And I just had somebody write me last week asking for resources because their child is come out as trans and is trying to find resources. And I was able to connect to different people in the community in other spaces. But that took a while to get that expertise, right? Because I didn't have it when I didn't teach me that in graduate school, right? That wasn't training they gave me, and you have to kind of learn it on the fly.
Well, when I was a 22-year-old TA at Ole Miss and I identified as a feminist, lots of young women came to me and told me that they were experiencing abuse by their boyfriends, that they had experienced sexual assault, that they needed to go have an abortion and they didn't know where to go. And it was because I self-identified as a feminist and was visibly queer. And that was like, okay, like you're somebody who's not going to judge me for this. And you're such a weirdo outsider in this milieu that like your opinion actually doesn't matter. Like you're not judging me in the way that all of these other women are judging me. So like you can maybe get me the help I need. And I was very struck by how many people came to me just because I self-identified as a feminist. And they were like, you must know how to do this. And I was like, I just moved here. I don't. I'm 22 years old. Like I know how to use the internet. Like I'll help you, but like I am not qualified to do this, you know? But I think like what you're saying, sometimes all it takes is just being somebody who's there to hold your hand and help walk you through whatever it is, you know, and just troubleshoot. And most people can actually get there on their own. They just need somebody to be present and kind and witness whatever is going on.
Yes, absolutely.
And
Yeah, jump in.
no, I was gonna say, we found that we used to have notebooks full of resources. We always had what we called the free shelves, and then the internet happened and we ended up doing away with those notebooks, but people really miss them. And we haven't been open for a year, but one of the things we've been talking about as we reopen is what kind of resources do we still really need to have for people? I mean, we used to have a housing notebook, which now it's like you're looking to look for an apartment for rent on Craigslist now or wherever it is. But it used to just be like everyone would put their little notices in our housing notebook. But people are still calling, for where's the queer hairdresser? Where's the, things that we know they can find on the internet, but they still want someone else to give them a little more guidance. Or they don't even know what resources actually exist. So.
Right. And it's not unlike the book issue too, which is like, you can now get any book if you know what to find, but how do you know where they are? How do you deal with all the information to find the one that's right? I think it's the same with information, right? You don't know how to curate them. You don't know how to judge them. And so having someone who has that expertise, it makes such a difference.
Well, it is literally also like I take for granted because, I do have the academic skills that I learned as a student of like, people don't know how to do a keyword search that will yield useful results. And it's easy to forget that is a learned skill that many people don't have access to. And so, so often sort of on the internet, people are quippy and are like, well, you could just Google that. And it's like, you can, and then like a nightmare of stuff is going to pop up. And a lot of, what we are seeing is that people are being bombarded by intentional misinformation across the whole spectrum of ideologies. And, people need help. And I think the more we can be open-hearted and generous around that instead of judgy, it will serve our movements better.
Yes, in fact, and I don't know if this is happening in Georgia, but in Mississippi, there's a whole phenomenon of women's health centers started by evangelical groups to mime someone who needs help to try to divert them from getting reproductive help or abortion access or any of that. So it's a real thing of trying to divert people. Yeah. You mentioned some of this. I really appreciate you talking about making mistakes, since I've made so many already that I don't know how to count them, so that you learn by failing and making mistakes. But could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the challenges you faced, maybe pick a couple, and how you came up with solutions? Like, what are some of the things you come up against in your time at the bookstore?
I don't know if it's a mistake, but in terms of things that have evolved over time. So Kerris's roots, Kerris means grace or gift in Greek, and Kerris's roots actually are as more of a lefty Christian bookstore. That when Linda Bryant and Barbara Borgman co-founded the store, they were in more in those circles, and they actually founded the store as a nonprofit and then became a for-profit. We always put that in quotes. and became a feminist bookstore after Linda came out as a lesbian in the early 80s, I think. But what we have done also in terms of is evolving over time and figuring out what it means to be a feminist bookstore, because Linda actually didn't even know feminist bookstores existed in 1974 when Charis was founded. But what that means in terms of who belongs and who doesn't belong, and who we want to support and represent. And when I started at Kerris, as an intern which was in 1991, the National Lesbian Conference was coming to Atlanta that year. And at that point in time, Kerris was still doing women-only programs once a month. And it wasn't even on the table, in my memory anyway, at that time, about what a trans-inclusive women's event would mean at that point in time. But they would always designate one program every month was a women-only program. And when I started at Kerris full-time, it was still on the table to make sure that I wasn't a separatist, because you couldn't be a lesbian separatist and actually work at Kerris, because we worked with the public and we were inclusive of all people. But we still had a sign up on our sexuality section that said this section is intended for women only. We didn't define women, but that's what the section said. And in our mind, and I'm saying our because I believed in that at the time, we felt like that was a way to make that particular section safe. Knowing that there's no way for anybody to ever really be safe all the time. But it took many, many years for us to change and take down that sign. I'm trying to remember when it was. It was after you came to Kerris.
Yeah, it was in the early 2000s.
And and in that there were, there were the sexuality debates around sex positivity and SM and where leather folk belonged and what kind of books we put in that section or didn't put in that section. And then it also meant that men who were there who wanted to just look at erotica with their girlfriends weren't welcome in the sex section. It meant people who actually didn't identify as women but were trans identified or didn't identify as women but wanted to look in that section didn't feel welcome. So we spent a long time having to, like, what would it mean to just take down that sign? And then we did, and everything was fine. You want to say more about
yeah,
it?
I mean, I think one of the questions that comes up so often in feminist communities, and particularly in lesbian feminist communities, is the role of safety, right? Like, how do we create safety? And one of the things that I think is really important is thinking about the fact that all people are capable of doing harm, and so you actually can't legislate safety by naming identities, right? And obviously, as a transgender man, I have my own experience of what it means to move from being someone who was read as safe to now being read as someone who is unsafe, right? But what the gift of that has been for me, particularly in being in feminist community, is I don't get a pass when I am at the bookstore. People who don't know me often are like, who's that random white man like behind the counter? Like, why is he here? That's not who I expect to have working in this space. Or, like, are you the sound guy? Are you the, like, people think I'm there to do some tech job. But the gift of that is that it has caused me to be much more thoughtful about my words and my actions. And that if I'm not just like riding on this path of assumed politics, then I really have to show up for people. And I need to be much more thoughtful about the ways that I am actually in solidarity with the people that I say that I care about. So when I think about what it means to create conditions of safety or relative safety at Charis, particularly because it is mostly my job to do that as the person that's physically sort of shaping the space around our events, it's mostly about communication, and it's about empowering, the other people who work there, but also even our community members to really say, like, in the moment, this thing makes me feel unsafe, like, and to name it and to give people more examples of language to say that are not based in, fictive ideas of biology or things like that, but instead just being like, this behavior right here is not okay. Like, this thing you just did is not okay. And I have seen drunk lesbians behave horribly to other women. I have seen men behave horribly to other men. Like, you can't legislate based on identity, but we can certainly name behaviors that we find unacceptable and teach people how to be brave about talking about them. And I think when we kind of got to that place, it made us all kind of do better at naming our own fears and the things that made us uncomfortable and asking for what we needed to feel safer. And, that doesn't always work, but it is really important. And it also, I think, particularly for white people, helps us do better around, interrupting racism as well. Because if you're already trying to be clear about, like, this behavior is not appropriate, it also sort of dissuades you from that sort of polite niceness that so much of white culture operates on.
I wanted to go back. I was smiling about the for-profit in quotation, Sarah. when I opened the bookstore, I'd made the decision to open as a nonprofit, mainly because I didn't want to give the impression that I was benefiting personally or financially from the bookstore, even though the quotations tell you it's kind of laughable, like, oh yeah, I'm going to make a fortune by opening a small feminist queer bookstore. So shifting gears from challenges, what's something that's really satisfying about your work? I mean, you know, we don't do it for the money. We don't do it to get wealthy. What is the thing that it feeds or gives you?
For me, it is, you know, when Trump got elected, all these people around me who I think are more liberal than me, more to the center, were just like throwing themselves on a funeral pyre. And I was like, you know, this is not a surprise to me. Um, but also I felt like, well, here we are. Like this is this is what I expected to happen. And all right, what are we going to do? And I think I felt less despondent because I am surrounded by people who are working every day in large and small ways to make the world better. And I see people really in micro and macro ways trying so hard to change themselves, and particularly white people really trying to undo the ways that white supremacy shows up. And so I know that there's a lot of despondency around, you know, as black people get murdered every day, as black people continue to be murdered every day by the police, there's a national despondency around white people's role in movement work, as there should be. But on an individual level, I have been really heartened by the massive shifts that I have seen, in people really changing and making huge divestments of cultural capital, of money, really changing some big things, putting some skin in the game to change our society in the last 5 years, or even in the last 8 years, really since Trayvon Martin was murdered. And I feel like, um, you know, it is slow work. It's too slow, but it is also, it is heartening to me, and it makes me feel less alone. So that for me is exciting. And the other piece is just like people are writing great stuff right now. There's an incredible explosion of queer and trans books right now, of feminist books, of anti-racist books, and they are on the whole very good. And that's an exciting thing. You know, we have new means of production around, you know, it's easier than ever to write books and disseminate stuff. And I think um, that's pretty thrilling. So those are my good things.
I mean, I will second the part about all the books. Just as the book buyer, our shelves are getting bigger and bigger because, and we don't have to carry as much as the stuff that I used to think we just had to put there because there was nothing else to put there. And now I'm like, oh, there's a wealth of literature for queer youth right now, which I saw some Facebook memory that from a couple years ago where I had opened up a box of galleys from Harper, and there were 3 queer YA galleys in it, and I couldn't believe that there were 3 from the same publisher in this one box, and now that happens all the time, which is amazing and feels different, and I'm grateful for it. And it also makes me think about honing in on what we really do, just because I'm always telling people now of late that a lot of what have been our bestsellers now have become more mainstream. Like we're in a moment that feminism feels popular. Multiculturalism, again in quotes, feels popular. And these are the books that have been our bestsellers, have been the books that we have always stocked, that we've always looked for. And they're easier to find, but now there's more discernment to figure out what it is we actually want to stock. And I think for me, having been at Kerris for over half of my life, and um, this is our 3rd location, and we're about to open back up to the public, I hope soon. But I feel like people have with long histories keep coming back. So, and I'm often the one that is just like, oh my God, that person, they've been our customer for 40 years because they told me this story, or, but they come back, and even if they think that they're our customer, even if they haven't been in our space in 10 years. I mean, they are our customer, but they think they are, and know that they are part of our community, and they'll come in and they'll say, do we have this? And I'm like, I haven't seen you in 10 years, but I know who you are, and I'm going to call you by name, and we're going to get you that book that you're now here for, because you no longer have you've broken up with your girlfriend of 20 years, and now you're back out in the world, or your kid is grown up, or you've gotten a new job, or whatever it is that has made them come back to Kerris, or come home to Kerris, is what we often say to people. Like, we want to be a place that they can come home to, and that we're going to be there. And even though we do change and evolve, I think that what is at our heart has been consistent.
And you're still going to have those books when mainstream publishing loses interest and moves on to something else. Like that consistent home is always going to be there. What are your dreams for the future? Like, do you have big dreams of things you'd like to do?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has been incredible about this pandemic time is our virtual events have been incredibly successful. And, we've had a commitment to accessibility in our physical space. But what I've heard from people, for years is, I really wish there was a way. I've been trying to figure out since 2014 how to get more of our events online. And, I could tape them, and a community member bought us a camera, but then like that was very hard to figure out. The camera didn't work very well. And so, this collective moment forced, unfortunately, because of ableism, like the only way this was going to happen was that all of us got forced onto this technology at once. But now that it's happened, we're never going to go back to only doing in-person events. It's more accessible for people with disabilities, but it's more accessible for parents of young children, elders who don't drive at night, people who can't afford bus fare to come see us, who literally just, who don't even have internet in their house, but they have a cell phone and they can watch it on their break at their job. Like, whatever it is, all of a sudden our events are opened up to the world. And what we found at the end of 2020 was we had all this data because everything was going through a server. And we found that people were watching our events in 66 countries around the world and over 1,000 small towns in America. And that had always been my hope for Charis, was that people would see that feminism and these concepts related to feminism, intersectional feminism, that is inherently anti-racist, that would be a mainstream American value, and that people would believe, especially against this rhetoric of Donald Trump and the GOP, which is getting more and more fascist every day, that people would see like the wholesomeness really of these values, and that these are positive family values, that these are like wholesome things that can help us live a better communal life, right? And to see like these teeny tiny towns, some in Mississippi, of course, but across the South and across the world, where people are tuning in to watch these things and build community, that was so exciting to me. And it just made me feel like, right, people are ready. People have a hunger for this. They want to be connected. They have lots of great ideas to share. And so I feel like that's a huge piece of whatever the future holds, is that we will stay connected virtually. And even though I do think we'll go back to some in-person events, because people do also want that, we will really retain a lot of the virtual events, because they've just opened us up to a whole new world of folks. And I can't imagine shutting that door now that it's open. It's been so wonderful for us.
When we moved to our new space, we moved to another new partnership. So we've got Kerris Books, we've got Kerris Circle, and now we're also partnered with Agnes Scott College, which is a historic trans inclusive women's college. It has a beautiful campus. We are located now in a building that is owned by Agnes Scott College, and we are their school store, not for their textbooks. They do their textbooks online, but for all their school swag. And we were just sort of getting going with that, and then had to close for the pandemic. And we're still figuring that part out. And I think, when I think about the future, I'm literally just am thinking about what will it mean to reopen our doors? Like, what do we need to do, and how do we want to reinvent ourselves again? Because it is a moment that we can do some of that, as we figure out what kind of programs we're going to have, or what groups are going to meet, what kind of books we really need on the shelves, because we've just been doing online orders, and hasn't mattered as much as what's on the shelf. We're just a giant warehouse, but people are going to be looking at our shelves. It's going to matter again. So that's the near future that I'm thinking about.
All right, one more question before we open it up to questions from the audience, and please put it in the Q&A and chat, everyone, if you have. I have one waiting. But here's my last question. And I know you've done this. This isn't theoretical, since I called you for this very advice. What advice would you give to someone who wanted to start a queer feminist bookstore?
I think you start with your values. So I think I think if you can kind of create a decision matrix based on your values, that really helps, you figure everything else out. Because if sort of, okay, well, these are the parameters of what I am willing to do and not willing to do based on my ethics, then it's much easier. You just eliminate a lot of stuff right off the bat, right? I mean, one of the I think running a mission-driven space is in some ways easier than running a non-mission driven space, because I look sometimes at these general bookstores and I'm like, how do you decide what to carry? How do you decide what? It feels very confusing and arbitrary to me, because it just feels subjective and based on taste, which I guess is fine, but there's no overriding aesthetic or ethos to it. And I think for us, it's like everything follows from our values. And then, whether that's like how we navigate our interpersonal communication between one another and our staff, how we communicate with our customers, how we do our social media, how Sarah decides what books to buy, how I decide what programs to book, all of that comes from our values. So I think getting clear, like writing your personal mission statement, writing out your values, writing out your vision for your kind of ideal space, and really leaning into that feels really key. And then absolutely talk to people who've done it, about the nitty gritty stuff. I went to the library when I became the executive director and read all these like tax law books, because I was a creative writing major and then an English, major in graduate school. So I had no tax or business background. Sarah had no business background. All of that stuff is learnable. I think there are lots of people who have written very simple, those like business for dummies books. They're fine. You feel free to read those books. You're not a dummy if you read them. They are helpful. Figure out how to be in compliance with the law. Don't mess yourself over by not paying taxes. Do all the stuff you need to do. And ask for help, because lots of people want to help. And I think, don't be a martyr and don't be a hero, and get as many community members involved as you can once you are clear about what your vision is. I would suggest not inviting folks in until you're really crystal clear on, this is my project, this is what I'm doing, here's how I want to invite folks in.
I'm curious, Jamie, to actually hear from you about this, just because I've been working on our list of feminist bookstores, which we maintain on our website, because there used to be a feminist bookstore network. There isn't one anymore. But a couple years ago, we were down to about 13 feminist bookstores, which, we have a broad definition of that because we don't want to define that for someone else. But if they're calling themselves a feminist bookstore, we've been putting them on our list. There were 120 at one point. We're down to 13. Now we're up to 19 that I have found in the United States, and then probably another 20 internationally. But I think people, maybe not on this call, but people are going to be like, there's a feminist and queer bookstore in Water Valley, Mississippi. Tell us about it.
Okay. Well, there's a longer answer, like the longer version and the shorter version. So the longest version is anyone who loves books is like, bookstore, wouldn't that be amazing? So like every other kid who loves books, I love the idea, even though, as I joke with ER, I never actually worked in a bookstore till I opened one, which is probably not the best way to go about it. I'll just throw that out there. The next phase was writing this book, The Lesbian South, where I was writing about all these Southern lesbian feminist writers, and they were all involved in the women in print movement. They were running bookstores and running presses, and they were going to these networking, meetings, and they were doing all this. And they did this while they were writing this great poetry and novels. And it was just, I had this whole vision of this network that they did. They were just out of college. None of them had any money. They had like a couple $100. They're living in a walk-up cold water flat, and they just said, we're gonna start a bookstore. And I thought, I have way more advantages than they do. I actually have a salary, so I'm already ahead of the game. And there's this, like, you can crowdsource and get some startup money. So I just thought I could do this, because they did something that was just incredible, where they had to learn how to set type. You know what I mean? Like, they were like doing it with the actual paper and the ink and all this. I'm like, it's so much easier. And then I think more immediately, the political situation that came about, the year before Trump was elected, Mississippi passed HB 1523, which was a religious freedom anti-queer bill that really made queer people in the state feel like they were under siege, and they really felt like no one's standing up for us. And I thought, this doesn't really make any practical sense. I have a full-time job. I have no experience. Like, this is not something, but like, it needs to happen now. And I want to do something. And what I know is books, and what I love is books. So I thought, this is something I can do to try to help and stand up for queer youth in the state, and stand up for people who that doesn't reflect their values. So that's why I did it when I did it, which is really, it's really like do this in retirement. That probably made more sense. But what happened then, there was this perfect little space that opened up, right? That was right next to my wife's restaurant in Water Valley, that is 10 feet wide and 40 feet deep. It was an alley, and then they covered it. And it was a cigar store when they first did in the 1890s. And then it was a barber shop for like 40 years. And I still get men coming in to tell me about going there. And actually I put up a barber's pole recently just to kind of go back to that history. And then it was an art gallery, and then it was empty. And I was like, that would be such a cool little bookstore. It's small, you could make little spaces in it, you wouldn't have to fill the whole thing up right away with all this stuff. So I was just sort of randomly talking to Dixie, my wife, and saying, if you run into Coulter, tell her that might be a cool idea. And Coulter says, oh, that's a great idea. Okay, it's available in 6 months, so you can have it in November. And all of a sudden, what was daydreaming became this real thing. And I had a panic moment, right? Like, wait a minute, I don't know anything about this. But I just took the leap, and I was inspired by places like Charis and like Legulia, and this like new lesbian feminist bookstore up in Montreal. They just started. And I thought, what's the worst that can happen? If I fail and I can't do it, I won't have a bookstore. I don't have a bookstore now. I'll be in the same position, but at least I'll have tried it, And I really felt like there was a serendipity around it. When I started to talk to people, the American Association of University Women in Oxford used to have an annual book sale, and they decided to stop doing it. And I knew the people who ran it, and I said, hey, what are you doing with the leftover books? And they were like, oh my God, will you take them off my hands? We've been paying storage. And so they gave me 2,000 volumes, right? And, I met people, like I knew a gay alum from the law school. He set it up for me as a nonprofit. I knew a lesbian from Water Valley who was an accountant who does the books for me, because you don't want English professors doing the books ever, right? It's like, get me people who could do these things. And then I had an AmeriCorps volunteer, Ellis, who had worked at Square Books and had, way more experience than I had. And Ellis said, hey, what if we did a Kickstarter campaign? I said, how do you do that? Let's try it. Okay. Ellis shot a video and we posted it, and I had no idea how this was going to work. And it just took off, right? Because all the Mississippians that I knew and all the former students shared it. And so we met our goal in like 4 days, and it got all this attention. And so all of that really came together in a way. So after all of that, it was like, okay, well, we'll just figure out how to do it, right? And then we'll just start small, and we'll try it, and we'll make mistakes, and we'll keep moving forward. So, I think because it's the only one right now in the state, and because people say, oh my God, queer feminist bookstore in Mississippi, how is that? It gets attention, and it gets people who want to come visit, and I get tourists come to see me, and people still ship me books. Like when I first opened, I was getting books every week from people, which is really lovely, but I still will get a random book from somebody I don't know. Like, hey, I was clearing out my book space and I want to help your bookstore. So here's this really cool box of books. And that all of those donations of professors and students graduating and people retiring, you know, keeps the bookstore going. So I set it up as kind of a used bookstore with, and I get new books for the queer and feminist section. So it's like I kind of keep my larger expenses smaller, but I'm able to kind of keep all that stuff together. So for me, it was just, and it was so great to be able to call up ER and say, ER, I have no idea what I'm doing, help, you know, and because it's this feminist network, everyone's like, yes, we want to help. That's great. We want more. So it's been, for me, it's been a dream come true to be able to have a bookstore, to be able to have a space that has a rainbow flag in the window 24/7, right? That has all these books for people. And you get, when youth come in and they see themselves reflected for the first time, and they're so excited, they like are dancing in a circle. I mean, it makes everything worth it. And they do that all the time. They're so excited to come in and see a trans section, right? And they'll say to me, I didn't know there were this many queer books in the world. And I'll say, this isn't even a quarter of them. This is just a little smattering. There's a whole world for you, you know? So that's the part that's been great for me. And, you know, I've made mistakes and learned a lot, but I think the best thing I did is that I didn't try to make it too big. You know, I didn't try to make it too much to start. And I'm hoping we're at a place now where I'm looking to hire a bookseller, because I've just basically been doing it all volunteer since I opened it. We'll open 1 day a week. I'd like it. It's a space we can maybe grow. And, you know, what we don't have that Atlanta has is a big population that can support it with, you know, that we have cheap rent, which is a positive, but it also means we have a really small population. So trying to get enough to pay somebody has been my challenge. But, you know, people have been really supportive and generous. So I'm really grateful for it.
I love that story.
Okay. I have one question that came in, which is from Kate Leland. How can we support Kerris and Violet Valley other than by buying your books?
Well, a huge thing for us is you can share things that we put out on our social media, and you can invite people to events. You can attend our events. I'll drop some of that in the chat at the end, but that is a free way that you can support things that you love that really is actually truly helpful. And of course you can donate to our nonprofit, but really a huge thing you can do for any, not just bookstores, but any small organization that you like is like their Facebook stuff, like their Instagram posts, like retweet their stuff on Twitter, because the algorithms are a bit against us. So it really does help a lot.
All right, I've got a question from Michelle Bright. So for Kerris, what's the most successful event you've held, and what do you think contributed to its success? Was it a reading or some other type of program?
So during the pandemic, the two largest events we have had, one was Alexis Pauline Gumb's book release party for Undrowned. Alexis grew up like me at Charis and was another founding member of the Young Women's Writers Group, and she went on to write a ton of incredible sort of interesting, poetic, scholarly, feminist texts. So we had done a long pre-order campaign for that book. Her publisher is AK Press for that book in particular. And so it was a number of things. It was Alexis being who she is, and yes, Alexis being Alexis, and that book being magical, and AK Press helping support our pre-order campaign. You know, now one of the things that's important for small bookstores to do is to sell as many books as possible before the book comes out, which is a little confusing. But Amazon has made it such that if you don't sell as many books as possible before the book comes out, they have captured all those sales. So it's a weird thing that has changed a lot in our industry, that now we hone in on the books that are really our people's books, like Alexis and other community members. And, you know, Sarah in particular does this, and says, okay, these are the books that we're promoting because these are really our people that we want to celebrate. And then we start promoting those 3-6 months, sometimes even 9 months out. And I try and be like, okay, you're doing this, you're supporting these books, I'm going to do everything I can to make an event happen. Another event that actually wasn't tied to a book that was really successful was Dartricia Rollins, who's the assistant director of Kerris Circle, really wanted to do an International Women's Day event. And so she invited Dr. Joy James and Jaleesa Jackson to come talk about radicalizing feminisms. And so really doing a decolonial perspective on feminism and an internationalist perspective, and basically like what are ways that U.S. feminists can be in solidarity, particularly with African feminist movements, and what are like ways that U.S. feminists are missing stuff because imperialism has really just like messed up our brains. And that was an incredible event, and that's also an event where a lot of people, I think, got turned on to Charis. There's a lot of solidarity with other movements that we had a lot of socialists and a lot of communists who, you know, had kind of been siloed before, and like we weren't doing a lot of work with them. A lot of like cisgender men, socialists and communists, I should say, got really into what we were doing because they're like, oh, you know, here's where our work connects. So those were two books or two events in the last 6 months that were really powerful and that continue to get the most views on YouTube.
Very cool. I'm taking mental notes as you're talking here. It's just like very exciting to sort of think about all of that. I would just probably go back to Kate's question, you know, about supporting. If you can find something to buy, you know, buy something, right? It's like there are very narrow margins in bookstores, right? That so, you know, I sometimes have people come and like chill out for an hour and they don't even buy a button, you know, and leave it. I'm like, I'm glad to see you. It's super awesome. But like, you know, we are looking at like being able to cover our expenses versus not this month, right? And so that, think about what you can buy. Think if there's something you can donate. If you can't do that, shout them out. You know, I can't tell you how many times when there's like a story or someone has posted it or I get put on a list somewhere, I get a rush of online orders. And that's great. I mean, that really helps, right? So anytime you can do that and mention that, if you can weave it into a conversation, that attention for a small store is amazing, right? I mean, to get that kind of attention is important. And it's, you know, if you are doing a lot of other things or you're really bootstrap operation, you don't have someone who does marketing and who's, you know, able to kind of bring all that stuff in there. So the more you can support it that way too, it's really helpful.
And also divest from Amazon, like in every facet of your life, and encourage other people to divest from Amazon, because Amazon, you know, obviously has destroyed books, but bookstores are really the canary in the coal mine, and Amazon is going to destroy our entire economy. So the more that folks can across the board divest, and I know it's hard, particularly if you live in a small town in a rural place, Amazon might actually be, you know, you might be choosing between Amazon and Walmart, like you might really be struggling to find good options. But I would encourage you even to look on eBay for independent sellers, because often you can find things direct, you know, for other kinds of things. And I think if anything, this pandemic has taught us that what we support will thrive and what we do not support will die. And it is really important that even you're sometimes people think, well, my $5 and my $10 doesn't matter, but it does. And one quick anecdote, because I know we're running out of time, when we fundraised for our building, a third of the money for our capital campaign to build our Agnes Scott building was an in-kind donation from Agnes Scott. A third of the money came from 4 rich people, and a third of the money came from community donations of $500 to $500. So, you know, and I consciously wanted that to be the balance, right? I knew we couldn't just do it in $500 to $500 increments, but I did not want it to be just rich people paying for this building, because anything that you want to really have your community love, it needs to be a gift of the community. And so those, you know, we had thousands of people who gave $5, and those people mattered. And I think sometimes there's this idea of like, only rich people can be philanthropists, only rich people can be donors. And I would just encourage you, you do not have to be rich to give to the things that you love. And I write thank you notes to every single person who gives money to Kerris at some point in the year. Not every time, always, but like, it doesn't matter to me if you give $5 or $500. I trust that you're giving something that is significant to you and that matters, and I feel that. And so I just want to encourage folks, especially young people who maybe really don't have much money, don't ever feel embarrassed to give what you can, because it really is meaningful, especially to movement work.
I want to give a shout out to Carol CJ, who just did a great comment in the chat about gift certificates, which is great, but also Carol CJ, one of my heroes, right? Founder of Feminist Bookstore News. So important. Everything we do is so dependent on the work you did. So thank you. I want to thank you too for taking the time to talk with us today. It's been such a pleasure to get to learn from you and to talk more about it. I'm so grateful for the work you do, and I can't wait to come see your new location. If I can do a brief shout out before I let everyone go, for those of you in the Oxford area, we are having, for the first time in about a year, a live event. And so if you just have time if you're in Oxford to hop in your car, get down here before 6. We're having 4 literary panelists who came to town who are speaking. Robert Fiesler, author of Tinderbox, Pip Gordon, author of Gay Faulkner, Addie Tsai, author of Dear Twin, the YA novel, and Sarah Shepard, who's going to come and read from one of her plays. There'll be food and wine and hopefully queer fellowship, and we'd love to see you there. Thank you both, and everyone support your local queer feminist bookstores. And if you don't have one locally, you can order directly from ER and Sarah. So thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here.
This was so fun.
Thank you.